The enemy was saluting us. They were receiving us with mortar and artillery fire. 10,000 Japanese awaited us on the island of Peleliu. 10,000 men, as brave and determined and skillful as ever a garrison was since the art of warfare began. It was a terrible rain and did terrible work among us before we reached the beaches. The 1st Marine Division began their journey to the South Pacific in early 1942. By the time they arrived on Peleliu, they have traveled nearly 7,000 miles from the land they called the good old USA. By early 1945, the American island hopping campaign had the Japanese in a defensive posture. Japanese commanders were determined to make American Marines pay for every inch of ground gained by employing a 10 lives for 1 vow within fighting ranks. As General MacArthur's forces advanced on a westerly path toward the Philippine Islands, Admiral Nimitz was leading the island-hopping campaign through the Central Pacific. The Japanese air attack on the Philippines was a major cause for concern, so General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz chose to attack Peleliu to make sure his right flank was secure. If General MacArthur would have cut off the Japs using a naval screen, the Americans wouldn't have lost as many men. If MacArthur would have set up a naval screen, he still would have been able to make the attack on the Philippines with his right flank secure. Admiral William F. Halsey suggested calling off the Peleliu operations after learning that the Japanese air power was not as strong as the original intelligence had said it was. But MacArthur believed that the operation should proceed, and Admiral Nimitz said it was too late because the convoy was already underway.
After 3 days of fighting, the airfield on Peleliu was captured.
The immediate reports back were that it would be over in a day or two. But that was not the case at all. The worst was waiting for us.
As casualties mounted, it became clear that U.S. intelligence had failed to anticipate the level of Japanese resistance. Looming behind the airfield were high coral ridges that spanned the island. The Japanese had created an elaborate system of underground fortresses.
Intelligence didn't have a clue what we were going into. If the intelligence had been what it should have been, I don't think we'd ever hit that island.
What did the United States gain from the conquest of Peleliu? First, victory ensured a secure right flank during MacArthur's advance on the Philippines. The most visible benefit of a subdued Peleliu lay in its use as a link in the flight path and line of communications from Hawaii, and from the Marianas to the Philippines. The holding was a convenience, but not a necessity. 3 days before the attack, Admiral Halsey went to General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz to tell them that the original intelligence was inaccurate. Reconnaissance flyovers of Peleliu indicated that Japanese air power wasn't as strong as earlier intelligence reports indicated. Taking the island assured absolute domination of all of Peleliu, thereby adding marginally to the security of MacArthur's right flank as he continued westward, then northward from New Guinea into his Philippines campaign.
9,500 Americans were killed or wounded for an operation that may not have been needed. Positive consequence was that American planners began to understand Japan's change in tactics. Negative consequence on the Americans was that from the time the battle ended, people realized that Peleliu was not a necessity. A few months later, the attacks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa would confirm this grim calculus of war against determined Japanese defender.
3 days prior to the kickoff of Operation Stalemate 2, Admiral William Halsey communicated with Nimitz his belief that an all-out attack on Peleliu may not be necessary. Halsey had believed that the Japs would be beaten by the beginning of 1944. By the time the Battle of Peleliu had taken place, American naval power and air power in the Pacific was far greater than the Japanese. American dominance of the region was enough to convince Halsey that an assault of Peleliu would not be needed. Instead, the Third Fleet would bypass the Japanese force and isolate them by setting up a naval blockade.
The invasion of the Philippines is only weeks away, but some U.S. commanders have raised doubts about the Peleliu operation.
Admiral Halsey had recommended a cancellation of this operation because when he had an air raid against the southern Philippines shortly before Peleliu was to take place, he found out that the Japanese were not that strongly engaged in the southern Philippines. But Admiral Nimitz argued to keep Peleliu. He felt that the air bases there would still play a pivotal role.
Historians will always debate the question regarding Peleliu. Two veteran naval commanders at odds over strategy meant that the only real winner or loser was going to be the men of the stalemate to assault force. While we can always debate the wisdom of Nimitz's decision to attack, we can never debate the courage of the men who carried out the orders. What purpose then does this debate serve? Adam, Kyle, and I are hopeful that the Marines and soldiers' sacrifices at Peleliu will continue to be brought to light. We hope to educate you and further generations about the sacrifices made by thousands of brave Americans during the greatest conflict in human history. Because of them, we are free today.